Good evening, and my name is Jelaine Towdros, and I'm chair of the Stuart Hall Foundation. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all of you who are joining us this evening for the first of an online programme of conversations, podcasts, and writings under the banner Reconstruction Work, which we're launching today, and which will explore how the long histories of Black and Brown cultural and political activism can help us construct just and equal futures, working across different generations and geographies. For those of you who don't already know about us, the Stuart Hall Foundation was established 5 years ago, inspired by the life and work of Professor Stuart Hall. We're a small charity with big ambitions, committed to public education and in particular to addressing urgent questions of race and inequality in culture and society through talks and events, and by building a growing network of Stuart Hall Fellow scholars, activists, and artists in residence. Talking in The Guardian last week about the Black Lives Matter protests, the veteran civil rights campaigner and patron of the Stuart Hall Foundation, Angela Davis, highlighted the critical need to translate protest into societal change. The most important thing, she said, is to begin to give expression to ideas about what we can do next. This morning, speaking on Radio 4, Graça Machel, African social justice and political activist, and one of the world's leading advocates for women's and children's rights, made a call for bold action in an open letter with other women activists. They said, COVID-19 has unearthed massive inequalities within our societies and brought to glaring light the unique burdens which women carry the world over. They called for a response to the immediate needs of the crisis, but at the same time urged us to look to the future and to find ways to simultaneously dismantle the structural systemic barriers which reinforce inequality and disenfranchisement. Here at the Stuart Hall Foundation, we want to create a platform to give expression to ideas about what we do next, so that together, across different generations and geographies, we can grasp the opportunity to reimagine and redesign our society into a vibrant and equitable one. To start this conversation, I'm delighted to welcome tonight's two distinguished speakers. Lola Olufemi is a Black feminist writer, organiser and researcher from London. Her work focuses on the uses of the feminist imagination and its relationship with futurity. She holds an undergraduate degree in English literature from the University of Cambridge and an MA in gender studies from SOAS, University of London. She's co-author of A Fly Girl's Guide to University and author of Feminism Interrupted, Disrupting Power, a member of Bare Minimum, an interdisciplinary anti-work arts collective, and she's a recipient of the Techni AHRC Doctoral Training Partnership between the Stuart Hall Foundation, CREAM, and Westminster School of Arts. Her project there will be looking at the uses of the imagination in the cultural production of Black and Asian revolutionary movements, art collectives, and feminist, anti-racist organising formations in the UK. Lola's book is available right now at Pluto Press, who have a special offer on works by Black authors until 30th of June. That's Monday, so don't hang around. Gary Younge is an award-winning author, broadcaster, and columnist, and professor of sociology at the University of Manchester. He worked for The Guardian for over 20 years, during which time he reported from all over Europe, Africa, the US, and the Caribbean, before being appointed The Guardian's US correspondent in 2003, and then editor-at-large in 2015. He's won several prizes for his journalism and has written 5 books: Another Day in the Death of America, A Chronicle of 10 Short Lives, The Speech, the story behind Martin Luther King's dream, Who Are We and Should It Matter in the 21st Century, Stranger in a Strange Land, Travels in the Disunited States, and No Place Like Home, A Black Britain's Journey Through the Deep South. His books have received considerable acclaim, with several of his titles either winning or being shortlisted for major literary awards. He holds a number of honorary doctorates from universities in the US and the UK, and in 2016, he was made a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. Please join me in welcoming Gary and Lola. They'll be starting a conversation, and after a while, we'll invite you to, they'll respond to your questions, and you've got an opportunity to ask questions all through the conversation. You just need to click on your Q&A button at the bottom of your screens, and you can post your questions there. Over to you, Lola.
Thank you so much, Gillian, for that wonderful introduction to this conversation. I guess I wanted to start with what brings us here, which is Stuart Hall and Stuart Hall's work. And I've been thinking a lot in this moment about his reception theory. So the idea that the producers of media texts encode them with meaning, and that those texts are received by their viewers in specific ways, in dominant ways, which are ways that the producers intend, in negotiated ways, and in oppositional ways, which are basically ways that are kind of critical of what is being consumed from the point of the consumer. So I was wondering, Gary, what you think, because I think the role of the journalist or the commentator, especially those allied to kind of progressive movements, is to kind of facilitate oppositional readings of text that we see from the state, from the government, etc., to a specific audience. So I was wondering if you could speak to, I guess, the role of what you see the role of the journalist being, and whether you think that critical capacity for journalists to kind of question the state and question what happens still exists.
I mean, it slightly depends what kind of journalism you're doing. I think that kind of when, for example, I was doing Beyond the Blade, which was a series on knife crime, it was really evidentiary what I was trying to do. I was trying to, for all of the things that had been written about knife crime, actually, people were incredibly ill-informed. I was ill-informed. There were no figures for who was dying among young people. There was no attempt to actually, newspapers generally covered the death and the sentencing. And so there was, in that sense, it was designed to kind of, to find more evidence, to have a more productive conversation. And because you don't know what the evidence is going to be, you don't know what kind of conversation is going to, you're going to have, but that the evidence itself would be better, I know, than the assumptions and presumptions that predated it. So during that series, for example, we managed to pry the numbers out of the government. That actually, they just wouldn't give them to you. Nobody knew. So then you wonder, well, what are we all talking about? And it was interesting. What we saw is that kind of kids who die through knife attacks in London are overwhelmingly Black, and in the rest of the country, they're really not. That if you look at it as a countrywide thing, for example, then there were Black kids weren't more than about a third, I don't think. And so anyway, the kind of the purpose there was to find out and to produce new information in order to have a richer conversation. When you're doing columns, though, I always saw my role as trying to provide people with my people, my progressive, nuanced left people, the community that I imagine in my head, to provide them with the tools to kind of go out there in their life, at work, at play, at dinner, and to kind of and to prod and to ask different questions, to have kind of information that may not have got to them elsewhere, that I had a week to think up all of this stuff while everybody else was doing their kind of, while everybody was doing their job. And that kind of, so I saw my job as a kind of, my role as a kind of facilitator, but kind of, there was an element in the question that you asked that I pined for, which was that in the absence of substantial movements, you're on your own. So it felt very lonely. I felt very, and I think others feel very untethered, which is why you can see people sometimes kind of just go spinning off into a kind of odd orbit, that there was kind of precious little to anchor you as a writer, to think, to kind of inform what you thought would be the most useful thing to do in a given moment. You had to make it up yourself.
I think there's lots there. I think, on the issue of knife crime and a whole bunch of other issues to do with the dispossession of Black communities in the UK, we see the ways that the state often obscures the real material causes of certain kinds of behavior or certain actions, right? And so I think it is incredibly important to have people who are willing to investigate really what material conditions drive people to do, essentially. And I think also you've spoken, or we've kind of talked a bit about the kind of pitfalls of punditry, and responding to what you said, I think it's the idea of the kind of lone writer who is facilitating a movement's demands or providing ideas for a movement's demands. I think the kind of structure of the writer in our culture, in our popular culture, is one that is purposefully intended to be disconnected from grassroots popular movements, right? Because the second that you start kind of writing for specific publications, or your writing enters specific spheres, you might lose connection with what is happening on the ground. So I wondered then if you could speak to, within the arena of the kind of professional classes of journalists, if you could speak to the pitfalls of punditry in that sense, and the ways in which the framings that you're given as a journalist or somebody who is asked to respond in the moment urgently to a specific question really doesn't allow for the kind of nuance and complex readings of situations that are critical if we're to come up with demands that are meaningful and come up with demands that change the way that people are living.
Well, I mean, first of all, I would say the state doesn't have to obscure these things, because the media will do it anyway. Do you know what I mean? That when it comes to knife crime, there was nothing to stop anybody pursuing a certain kind of line of inquiry or doing any of the things that we did. I mean, they did obscure those particular facts, but generally speaking, to find a family of the mother of a boy who had killed someone, and to hear her say, for her to show you the email that she sent to her MP saying, "Help me save my son," and to outline all the parenting classes and all the things she's done. It's not that anybody stopped anyone doing that. It's actually that there is a sense within the world of journalism that nobody really cares, because those people, the people making the judgment, don't care. And there's a kind of, it doesn't fit with the notion of what the metabolism of modern journalism would be. I mean, when it comes to punditry, I found myself conflicted. Not in terms of action, because in terms of action, I just very rarely do it. I will very rarely go on a show and chat for 10 minutes or 5 minutes, or it's usually even shorter than that. First of all, I don't have time. But actually, more importantly, I don't have the inclination. That you find yourself fighting your way out of somebody's frame and complicit in the construction of that frame, because unless you're going to blow it up and say, look, that is a ridiculous question, this whole setup is ridiculous, you're not asking the right questions, the other staff that, the other guests that you have on, you clearly have set this up as a kind of Punch and Judy thing. I'm off. Unless you're going to do that, then you have to sit and make nice, and you have to ask yourself, why did I do this? People go on shows, get insulted, then write about getting insulted on the show, and of course the responsibility lies with the person who did the insulting. And one has to kind of wonder sometimes, what were you doing when you went on that show? What did you think would happen? And I think that for a younger generation of activists, or a younger generation of journalists, not activists, but they are journalists who are active, who are politically active, there is a notion that you can build the movement through the media, that you're getting the message out there, that I just don't think that's true. And my experiences of, sitting in some studio, it's highly performative, and somebody who doesn't really give a crap about the issues that I care about, this is just one more thing for them. And it's like, Gary Younge, isn't this political correctness gone mad, or do you think that's right to go down and pull down a statue? What would you say if they pulled down a statue of Nelson Mandela? And you kind of like, well, and you've got really half a minute. And in that half a minute, you got to make a point, you got to make a joke, you got to who's got time? Yeah. Some people do it really well, and good on them if that's what they want to do. I find it kind of quite corrupting for myself. And so I just decided to opt out.
I think there are also ways in which it can perpetuate maybe a kind of counterintuitive culture of celebrity around people's ability to express specific points, right? Like it's not necessarily, I completely agree with what you're saying in that there isn't space to kind of expand on points, but also that you're always framed as an antagonist, right? And I think what movements have done so successfully is radical movements in the past, they've shown how outside of formal and legitimate authority, outside of the realm of being legitimized by specific institutions, you can set up networks of care, you can facilitate political education, you can write, you can do investigative journalism that doesn't necessarily have to conform to the ways that specific institutions would like you to respond to them. I guess I was wondering, this also made me think about the space that used to exist on television for this kind of critical intervention, also looking at like televisual essays that Stuart Hall was able to do in the 70s and the beginning of the 80s. And I wondered what your sense of like the changing media landscape is, and the ways in which that's kind of shut out the ability to make critical and meaningful interventions that aren't necessarily reduced to just sound bites.
Well, you got the kind of you got the formal media landscape, which every now and then something good gets in, but very rarely. And they also like to dramatize in a kind of almost, just in a ridiculous way. And I have personal experience of this when I did a trip through white America, looking at whiteness in America and its relationship to Trump. And we did interview Richard Spencer, which I could talk about, but which I felt was justified. Otherwise, we were looking at kind of meth addiction and the fact that white working class life expectancy was going down, and nostalgia and what that nostalgia meant for the Confederacy and economic decline. And they wanted to call it, this was Channel 4, they wanted to call it The Klan is Back. And, I said, it's just not true. Nobody says that. It's not true. In fact, the point is you don't need to climb back because Donald Trump actually is doing much of the work of white nativism. Like, it's just not true. And their response was, well, they really, really stuck with this for several weeks. And my feeling was that if you're going to do that, you're going to have to take my name off pretty much everything that I can take my name off, and the only promotional work I'll do is to denounce it and really throw a tantrum. And in the end, they called it angry white American, which is also not quite true. We didn't meet any angry people, really. But I could live with that. But their response when we resisted was, well, if you don't want it to go out at 9:00, then fine, call it something boring. Which is kind of really incredibly irresponsible. So there's that going on. A kind of, not even a sensationalism, a kind of knockabout sort of, it's all a lark, really. And so there's that, and a kind of desire for either spectacle. But there is also new media opportunities that kind of what Stuart couldn't have done, or John Berger with Ways of Seeing. You couldn't imagine that being on kind of, one of the first 4 channels now, is you can do it yourself. That we all have the capacity to produce and disseminate. And as the kind of flip side to not doing punditry, I did do a video with an organisation called Double Down News, and I think they got 33 minutes of footage, and they put out 11 minutes of it to kind of encourage people. And I think it had about 3 million views, and that's quite a reach. So there is the ability to kind of, which there wasn't in the 70s and 80s, to kind of just completely do a runaround, even with television, and just do your own thing.
And also, I think to recognise that the aim is not necessarily to go viral, right? The aim is to make a critical intervention into popular culture. And I think culture is the arena through which politics is lived, and often it's not taken very seriously. I think about the ways that we the ways that we think and speak about pop culture, the ways that we think and speak about the media. We don't understand that there are also political underpinnings to those things, right? That the incentive for those for people making these documentaries is not necessarily that critical intervention that we spoke about before. It is bums on seats, it is views, it is to satisfy a media conglomerate. It is the idea of producing material to be consumed. I'm thinking about what your thoughts are on this specific moment, especially the ways in which we know that Black communities especially are specifically made vulnerable to this virus, right? And in a way, there's no pre and post COVID. Those communities have been in a state of crisis for a long time in terms of being hardest hit by austerity. And I think about this moment of concurrent crisis that we're in. I think for me, it requires a study of radical histories from the past. And so I was wondering what you, as your experience, as somebody who has been, I guess, involved and adjacent to anti-racist organizing, movement building in that sense, what your sense of what is going on now is. I
feel that, there's COVID and the inequalities and the kind of the degree to which the anecdotal experience of COVID had to wait for the statistical and the reported experience to kind of catch up, that every now and then there would be a picture of all the doctors who died, and you'd be like, whoa, hang on a minute, you know. And I spoke to a guy who lost 28 people who he knew. He said about 8 of them were good friends, a guy in Tottenham. And there is a connection, I think, between those inequalities that are disproportionately killing Black, Bangladeshi, Pakistani people, and the kind of rebellions that we've seen. And it is the kind of that the COVID deaths are the product of a systemic, of years of generations, institutional, systemic discrimination that you don't catch on a camera and share on Facebook. They are the kind of, why are we in these jobs, on these shifts, in this housing, with this education? Why do we have to work when they don't have to work? Why are we living multi-generationally in cramped conditions? Why do we live in these particular areas of London or other cities? Why, kind of, in every sense, there is an explanation for how we got to be so present where that virus is, because the virus doesn't discriminate, society does. But explaining that, describing that, kind of keeping people's attention on that, and coming back to your kind of original point of kind of, as a kind of media practitioner, of trying to focus people's minds on something that they consider to be, well, that's kind of normal. You know, I have this, it's becoming a shtick now, but it's a way of understanding the news, is that kind of, they say when a dog bites a person, that's not news because you expect it. But when a person bites a dog, that's news. And I think news organizations have to ask themselves sometimes, actually, who owns these dogs? And why do the same people keep getting bitten? And what can we do about controlling these dogs? That somehow, sometimes actually, dogs biting people is a story. And that kind of there is a kind of comfort and a familiarity that says, well, that's where Black people live. That's where they work. That's how they survive. That's normal. When what's normal can also be obscene. And then you have the brazen, physical, murderous power of the state, best exemplified with George Floyd. And that is something that you can share, and that and that you can see, and that there's a large number of people in this moment who think, well, that is racism. But the other thing, and it's making a connection between those two things, that those things are connected. And we are in this kind of, this moment, this extended moment, it's gone on for a few weeks now, almost a month, of raised consciousness and raised awareness, which, frankly, I don't think we have the movement capacity to kind of to meet and leverage fully, somewhat, but not fully, and how that is going to play out, I think, is in play now. And it's in play politically, but it's also in play intellectually. How we understand this moment will have a major bearing on what comes next.
I think what's specifically, I guess, chilling about this moment is the way that we're seeing the narrative, the way we're seeing the state take control of the narrative of what is happening, right? We're being told that this is a major success, that everything can open now, even as we know and can see the numbers growing every day, even as we know that Black and brown communities are in close proximity to this violence, and because of that, they are more likely to be engaged in precarious work, means that their livelihoods are more in danger, that their families are more in danger. And I think what's also for me, as someone who's interested in movements, how they form, etc., the fact that people are organizing and that people are protesting in the middle of this global pandemic, that puts them in the closest proximity to violence, in the closest proximity to premature death, tells me or kind of signals to me that obviously this is not a singular moment of crisis, right? This is part of an ongoing state of emergency. And I think that what happens when we reframe it in that way is, one, we make clear the material conditions that are underlying people's lives that make it possible for, a moment, quote unquote, to appear. But we also, I think we do those movements justice, and we do the suffering and the pain that underpins people's, the demands that people are making on the street and in other arenas. We do them proper, justice. When we properly engage with the ways, with the ways that they are connecting the dots, right? So to not kind of dismiss anti-racist organizing that's happening now as simply a result of something that happened in America and then moved away, to respect our own kind of critical and radical histories that have always been attentive to the ways that Black and brown communities in the UK have been, materially dispossessed.
But Lola, do you think that because I know that the government, that they're talking, not every night now, but I'm not sure that they have taken control of the narrative, actually. I think they lost it. I think that kind of, I think that we are without any serious leadership, and that people think, well, what are you for? What are you doing? That they are kind of, there's been a full-scale kind of collapse in terms of confidence, or I don't know about full-scale, but significant collapse in anybody thinking that they really know what they're doing.
I think the way that I'm understanding and recognizing the narrativizing project from the state, at least, is as a project that's encouraging us not to remember, right? To not remember the mass death that we're witnessing, to not remember the ways that the government prolonged ways that they could have alleviated the suffering caused by this virus. I think that a lot of young people are kind of loosening their attachments. And we're seeing this in the way that, protests are erupting across the world. People are making connections across borders, but they're kind of loosening their attachments to the promises of, a stable life, the promises of nation, the ideas of belonging, the ideas of citizenship. And for me, that's what I'm seeing as the kind of main driving force, bringing young people together in terms of their organizing, is this idea that the state, we have to begin to think beyond the state. We have to find ways to think against it and beyond it simultaneously. And I think that that's where exciting demands are coming out, looking at demands like abolitionist demands, like defunding the police, abolishing prisons. People are understanding and beginning to recognize these institutions as not reformable. I think also about, Stuart Hall's Policing the Crisis, and how he wrote about in the introduction, the idea that, whilst hegemonic forces manufacture consent in specific ways and create the idea of a threat in the media, what's most crucial is abolishing the conditions that make the designation criminal possible in the world that we're living in. I guess I also wanted to ask, because I work on the imagination, and I think in your final piece for The Guardian, you wrote, "Sing yourself up, imagine a world where you might thrive, for which there is no evidence, and then fight for it." And I'm interested if you could, I think of the imagination as a specific area and site of possibility that brings that which doesn't exist into being. And I think that when people make radical demands, what they're doing is enacting liberatory futures now, even if they can't see them. So I wondered if you could speak, I guess, the idea of the idea of using imagination in your writing and in your organizing, and just in general in terms of how we're responding to this moment, but also thinking about ways that we can stay determined, right? I don't want to say hopeful, I don't want to say optimistic, because those to me seem facile, but I'm interested in, you know, what a radical determination looks like from your standpoint.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in the utopian, you know, that imagine that Martin Luther King went up to the steps in the Lincoln Monument and said, Lincoln Memorial, and said, I have a 10-point plan that we can get through Congress, and he didn't. He came and he had a broader vision of what might be possible, and that kind of, if politics is the art of the possible, then radicalism has to involve imagining other possibilities. And so the world that we want, the fact that we can't see it doesn't mean that we can't invent it as a lodestar, as a place to go. Now, you can't just dream. You have to wake up and you have to kind of work towards what you kind of want to do. But activists do that all the time. I don't think that is difficult. I think what can be challenging at times is to kind of look beyond the horizon to the world that we're trying to create. And I find that energizing and actually kind of quite crucial, and finally kind of emblematic of how we even got to where we are now. That the notion that this conversation between you and I, if you go back to our grandparents or great-grandparents, would have been unthinkable, I think. And so, yeah, I think there has to be the space for the utopian within our organizing and our kind of reflections.
I just want to encourage people to start asking questions in the Q&A box if they have any. And I guess this whole kind of conversation has been framed around the idea of reconstruction and how we begin to rebuild. And I think I've been thinking a lot alongside others about what rebuilding entails. And I personally think rebuilding entails, you know, the abolition of the world as we know it, really. And that you know, brings in a sense of chaos that I think makes some people uncomfortable or is scary. But when I think about reconstruction, I think about, you know, starting from the beginning and thinking about the ways in which this world and the way that our lives are organized in it is one, not to the benefit of all, but not in and is also not in a way that enables the human flourishing that might be possible if, you know, there were better ways that we could build together, or better ways that we built the world, in ways that enabled us to love and care for each other and decreased our proximity to violences of all kind. And I guess I want to ask, for me, I think in this moment, particularly the person that whose work embodies that the most is Angela Davis, in terms of how it has been incredibly steadfast in its demands, how it has adapted to the moment that we're in, and how it has been intergenerational in its nature, in the way that Angela Davis works with younger people, in the way that she engages with ideas that younger people are coming up with in terms of demands that they're making for their freedom. And so I wanted to end, perhaps before we go to questions, by asking whose work for you defines this idea of reconstruction or rebuilding. What does the future look like, even as it necessitates the destruction of what we know now, right? And the chaos that comes from looting, the chaos that comes from all of these processes that I think are necessary in order to build the worlds that we're working towards.
Yeah, if I had to, well, the two people, I guess, off the top of my head. One would be Claudia Jones, who I interviewed people that knew her, and she was, what did they say? Claudia had a beer wallet and a whiskey mouth. You know, she was a dynamic, brilliant woman who said, look, we're going to need a cultural response to the violence that we are experiencing, and set about creating the conditions for carnival. That she lived and breathed resistance. She set up newspapers. She got kicked out of countries. She just kept going. And then the other would be C.L.R. James, who was just indefatigable with his intellect and his capacity to always be matching and working and developing and aligning his intellect with his work in praxis.
To come back to just the Claudia Jones, I completely agree. And I think she was so steadfast in her political commitments and her communist political commitments, and how she kind of moved or sought to expand, you know, Marxist understandings at the time of how, you know, people related to everyone suffering, and the idea of understanding the intersection of race and gender as crucial to being able to properly speak to the ways that structures situated specific people's lives. I think we have a question, and it's from Celia, and she says, there seems to be more space to explore and think with imagination since COVID and the way it's paused the constant flow of capital. Can we keep carving out space for this once things return to normal?
I mean, yeah, we can. I mean, it won't be easy because if you think of what had to happen for this space to exist, I mean, they basically stopped the merry-go-round. And for those who have kids or elderly parents or whatever, I mean, it's not been uncomplicated, but you're right. There's been a kind of, there has been space. And it's actually just kind of, as things return to, or as the world starts turning again, I don't know that there'll be a normal, and it wasn't particularly normal before anyway. I feel like, you know, part of what's going to be in place, protecting that space, is about saying maybe, you know what, I don't have to actually go into work 5 days a week. I'll go in 2 days a week and I'll do the rest from home, or whatever it is. Finding everybody's space is different, and everybody's capacity to kind of use it and want it is different. But yes, but you know, there has been, among other things, a significant opportunity for reflection in this kind of grand pause that we've been in.
I think I agree, and I think maybe one of the things that COVID has done is denaturalize this idea of normal, right? We're seeing more and more people question what is normal. We're seeing how people's differing proximities to the virus, to violence in this moment kind of displaces the idea that normal ever existed. Normal was just an environment in which people's suffering and people's alienation was kind of hidden or accepted as necessary, or as the foundation of capital, as the foundation of the ways that people were living, right? There's another question that's just come in about whether we need new political parties as a means of kind of moving forward. The question kind of says that bottom-up organizations don't seem to be as important in this moment. And I was wondering what you think about the idea of, you know, political parties.
I mean, you am I right in thinking that you study kind of issues of protest and movements and?
Yeah, well, yeah, the cultural production of movements.
What's your feeling?
about political parties. I think that what we're seeing, wholesale is people turning away from electoral politics. And I think maybe the reason why that strikes fear in the heart of some is because they can only think of politics within that realm. But having studied radical histories, especially Black women's formations in the 70s and 80s, having looked at the ways that they they self-organized their communities and organized against sus laws, organized against virginity testing, organized political education schools for their children, etc. That for me is a prime example of how politics can exist and can be sustained outside of the realm of political parties or outside of the legitimate eye of the state, right? And I think we're seeing that in mutual aid networks. That's kind of what was scaled up in the moment that the state began to fail people in very meaningful ways. They suddenly relied and came to understand that they could rely on other people. They could rely on their neighbors, and that they might be able to help one another without the aid of the council, without the aid of kind of really bureaucratic bodies. And I think the future, how I'm seeing it, or at least how I want to think about it, is as things happening in multiple sites at once, right? That there is no kind of linear progress narrative. We've kind of abandoned that. And that will require or will be driven by a whole range of political practices and resistance strategies. So that doesn't have to be the vanguard party. It doesn't have to be electoral politics. It doesn't have to be a new formation. It can be situated in the grassroots, right? I think it's difficult because a lot of the infrastructure that would sustain those movements has been decimated because of austerity and because of a whole host of economic policies. But that's how I see it. There's another question that says, can we envisage new alliances and solidarities across different struggles to secure systematic change? It seems that whenever radical Black leaders envisage a bigger radical coalition, they posed a greater threat. But is this also a possibility? Is this also an opportunity?
I mean, it definitely does. It does feel like an opportunity insofar if you look at who was out demonstrating and who's taken to the streets. And one of the differences between now and the 60s was that there've been a lot of white people and a lot of young Black people who you don't usually see on demonstrations. So I personally think coalition building is essential generally, and that the opportunity for that in this moment where you have, particularly with age, where you have a generation of people who basically had their future taken away from them, who kind of may have come of age sometime during austerity and the crisis, but they've basically grown up through war, austerity, crisis, collapse, and now what's going to be another economic depression, that there is real potential for that significant group of people to kind of connect with people of color and those elements of kind of the union movement or labor movement, what's left of it, who are out there and prepared to work. So no, I think that actually the moment that we're seeing is a product of coalitions in a range of ways. Yeah,
I agree. And I think that often maybe when we talk about the past and we talk about the alliances and solidarities that existed before, we have this sense that they were devoid of tension or that there was no disruption. And I think what a new generation is kind of calling us to see is that tension and disruption and dissent has always existed within coalitions and will always be a major focal point of these coalitions. But that needn't mean that they don't work or that they aren't able to mobilize certain amounts of people. I think there is this really strange idea that unity implies an erasure of difference, or that unity implies that everybody thinks and believes and feels the same thing at any given time. And I think that that's just a really dangerous way to move forward, because it doesn't recognize how tension and how disruption and how disagreement might also be able to fuel our movements as well, right? Because it's not as if they were once unified and now they're scattered. There are a couple of more questions. Beth says, in terms of who informs and does the work of rebuilding, what do you think is the right balance between grassroots action and top-down structural change enacted by those within powerful institutions in society?
What's the right balance? I mean, the right balance is what works, you know, and yeah, when it works well, there is a symbiosis between whatever the leadership is and whatever the grassroots are, where they're kind of both learning from and listening to each other. But in any given moment, that's going to be different. That kind of there are moments, I think, of what I would call excessive and unnecessary democracy. That there are moments that demand action, and that you're not going to seek counsel with everybody on everything all the time, but that wherever there's power, there has to be accountability. And so whoever may be making those decisions in those critical moments will then have to answer for them. So I think it's a necessarily dynamic and evolving relationship. So you couldn't just put your finger and say, right, that's the right balance. The balance is going to shift.
Mm. Yeah, I think it's entirely dependent on the moment as well. There's another question from Cleo, who says, completely agree with what you were saying about political space outside of legislative and parliamentary politics, but do you think that parliamentary politics is still a blockage in creating the widespread change that needs to happen? Do we still need both, or can we make do with grassroots action?
I mean, I'll start on that one, but I mean, given that she's kind of responded to you, I mean, I think the last 5 years have been really instructive in terms of what's happened with Labour, and seeing both the potential and the pitfalls, the amount of effort, the kind of way in which that dominated what the left was doing, and I think it's a reasonable question, and it's not a question that kind of suggests an answer. Was it worth it? And if it was, then how? And if it wasn't, then how? And I don't think that answer is just a yes or no. I think it's a kind of here and there, but that so it was worth it in some respects and not in others. But it was edifying to see the degree to which the commentariat, the parliamentary Labour Party, the kind of, to which from the get-go, with absolutely no sense of embarrassment, was saying, well, he just shouldn't be the leader, that people have made the wrong decision, that people are about to make the wrong decision, that we should call off this election before he becomes the leader. The way in which that democratic decision was delegitimized, kind of, I've seen people over the last couple of days with the row over Keir Starmer and Rebecca Long-Bailey say, some people have said, if you leave the Labour Party, which I haven't been a member of since like 1992, by the way, but like if you leave the Labour Party, you will be ceding, all power to the kind of right wing of the Labour Party. And there's quite a bit of me that thinks, well, you know what, maybe your time is better spent elsewhere. And then there's a bit of me that thinks, Yeah, there was something that happened with that moment, with those last 5 years. There was something that happened, and we can talk about what happened in December with the catastrophic electoral decline. We can also talk about what happened in 2017, when large numbers of people came out and voted for, I mean, a pretty kind of standard social democratic agenda, but a guy who, after a bomb, said, you know what, we're going to have to think about our foreign policy, and who did challenge norms in a range of ways. So, so long as there is parliament and there's power in that parliament, we can't just ignore it. I do think the last 5 years raises an important question for which I don't actually have an answer, but it's a question we should be asking, which is, what can we do with this thing? What will they let us do? What can we force them to make possible? And when are we wasting our time? And where are we wasting our time?
I think for me, my imagination is bigger than the party political project, and I feel like it's never really been satiated by the party political project. And I think especially around like ideas of social democracy, etc., because what I'm interested in my work and just in general in terms of the social organization of the world is non-hierarchical organizations that enable, human flourishing, as I said before. And I think maybe what gets lost in the idea of people placing all of their energy and all of their power and kind of strategic eye in parliamentary politics is that after said party gets into power, we're still going to be making demands. And I think that grassroots organisers know that well, that no matter what party is in power, we're still making demands about the kind of world we would like to live in, and about the inevitable austerity cuts that come from whoever is the governing party at any given time. And so I think for me, it's a question of strategy. It needn't mean, a hostile necessarily attitude towards people who are invested in that project. But I think it's more about thinking about what comes next, right? After we invest our energy in the party political project, and in many ways it begins to fail us again. That's what I'm interested in, that kind of what seems like a cyclical process of failure or whatever. But what I've seen from, I guess, grassroots movements and what the ways that I've seen them approach things like elections, etc., is seeing, what reforms, what they can get on the agenda, what non-reformist reforms can they push through these specific parties, how can they bend the party political project so it becomes as radical as possible, so that even if it, and even when it does, what do we do when it is necessary for us to abandon it? I think that there's lots to kind of think about there. There's a question about utopia, and I guess this person wants you to speak to the kind of processes involved in getting in achieving our utopic visions, right? Not necessarily concrete things, but what do you think is required of us now, or the world that we're living in now, or our communities, in order to enact those visions?
It depends which community. I'm minded of, I'm blanking on whose quote this is, but it's not mine, who says, what should we do today so that tomorrow we can do what we could not do today? And that's how I think of political work, is making space, is creating space for that future, and to not be afraid to make demands that aren't going to happen right now, may happen never in our lifetime, but should happen, are necessary. When you talked about Angela Davis and talking about abolishing prisons and defunding the police, she's been saying this for years. Now suddenly there's a space and people are kind of moving into that space. But someone had to do the work to clear that space. And so, like I say, I don't think we should only be doing this, but that, building the basic income, the notion of universal basic income, that started as some kind of like crazy notion, which is now a much discussed notion. And you know what? Even as we're doing this, our enemies and opponents are doing this. They are imagining dystopias all the time. And actually, they are have proved much more capable of holding that space and actually doing something about it. The hellscapes of children in cages and boats being allowed to drown with people on them, that is a product of people thinking, well, we may not be able to get away with this now, but let's keep plugging away at this and see what we can do. So, there is, in terms of our competition, there is a real race on to kind of come up with not just the immediate and the plausible, yes, we need that, but the kind of the notion that we're not just against this and we don't just want to do this tomorrow. This is the world we want to build. This is the world. I want to live in a world, let's say, without borders and border guards. I don't want to waste all that money that we waste on borders and border guards that could be invested in this and that. You should be able to live and love and work. I'm not suggesting this is going to happen tomorrow, but that is the world I would like to live in. And to say that and then step back, and of course people will say, what about this and what about that? But suddenly they're talking about the thing that you want them to talk about. That you've started a conversation about a world and you don't know where these things land.
Yeah, I think I completely agree. And I think that when we clear space in that way, we open up room for possibility. And I think it's another argument against reform, right? It's another argument to make our demands as ambitious as possible, because our enemies, those that seek to maintain the structural organization of this world that is dependent on some people suffering, they make radical and ambitious claims in terms of attempting to maintain that suffering. And so for us, we have to begin to act as if we can ask for everything. And I take that idea from Diane de Prima, like this idea that we should kind of resist the hegemonic forces at any given time that are sitting on our imaginations and that make things that are totally possible seem impossible. And not let that stifle, I guess, the demands that we make. Thank you, Gary. This has been an incredible conversation. And I think we'll end there on that incredibly kind of, that for me is the idea of determination that I was trying to get at, right? That it's not, an endless optimism, but it is a determined commitment to that world that we seek to build, essentially. And Jelane's back, so I'll hand back over to her.
Well, thank you both for just fabulous conversation. Really, really, my mind is racing with so many possibilities. I don't want to say more because you've said so much that I just want to take away and nurture and ruminate upon. I just want to flag to everyone who's listening that the next talk will be on July the 31st. And I want to take, Lola, your provocation to use our imaginations and to think about imagination in relation to radical determination. And to Gary, I think your impetus and drive for us to create a space for utopianism is so important, to look beyond the horizon of the world we have today, and to do the hard work, because let's not underestimate it, the hard political and imaginative and intellectual work that's required to imagine a future that is radically different and is one that we can claim. While our enemies are busy, we should be busier. We should be more utopian, more imaginative, more daring. Thank you for opening up that possibility this evening and opening up this new series. Thank you both so much. Lola, Gary, it's been a real pleasure and delight to be with you this evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you.